Hello students, I am Dr. Saleha Jamal, Faculty Department of Geography from Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. I am here with the course Climate Change Vulnerability and Adaptation, and today's topic of discussion is Paris Agreement 2015. As you know, in this week we were discussing about the different agreement summits that the UNFCCC had under the Conference of Parties like Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement. So let us start today's class. When we talk about Paris Agreement, it is also one of the Conference of Parties that were set under UNFCCC, in which the decision-making bodies used to meet every year to evaluate, to frame out certain strategies to reduce the greenhouse emission in order to control the ongoing climate change. So Paris Agreement is also a groundbreaking international accord which was adopted in 2015 at the 21st Conference of the Parties. That's why it is known as COP21, because it is the 21st meeting of the Conference of Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. So this thing you have to remember, student, this Paris Agreement which was held in 2015 and it was COP21, means 21st meeting of UNFCCC, and this climate accord or conference, 21st Conference of Parties, was under the UNFCCC. So this thing you have to memorize. Paris Agreement represents over the overall global community. It almost incorporated all the countries of the world, and it has induced a comprehensive effort in order to address the climate change by reducing the greenhouse gas emission and also by enhancing the resilience to the climate impacts. When I talk here the term resilience, student, it means to devise certain infrastructure, certain means which can withstand with the extreme effects of the climate change. That is, we call it developing resilience. So, Paris Agreement talked about the efforts to address the climate change, particularly by reducing the greenhouse gas and secondly by enhancing the resilience. So, you have to remember this: reducing greenhouse gas emission and enhancing resilience. If you remember about the Kyoto Protocol, which we already discussed in the previous lecture, according to this Kyoto Protocol, which set the binding targets mainly for the developed nations, that how much greenhouse emissions they are allowed for. So they have set some binding targets under the Kyoto Protocol. But if we see the Paris Agreement, if we analyze the Paris Agreement, it involves all the countries, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which only involved the developed countries to set the binding targets. But in this Paris Agreement, it involved all the countries, either it is developed or the developing nations, for setting their own climate goals, which is known as NDCs. Already I have talked about NDCs. Let us see some of the important objectives of this Paris Agreement. The first objective of the Paris Agreement is to limit global temperature rise. This was the almost, we can say, the focal point of each and every Conference of Parties, and Paris Agreement also continued the same, limiting the global temperature rise. It had framed out that the primary goal of this summit is to limit the global warming at least to well below 2 degrees centigrade if we compare it above pre-industrial levels. From pre-industrial level, what were the limits of the emissions, or so what were the limit of the temperature? At least it should be maintained below 2 degrees centigrade. While pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase 1.5 degrees centigrade. That we should effort, according to this agreement, the objective set was that we should effort to maintain the temperature increase only up to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the limit set was that the temperature rise should not be more than 2 degree centigrade. It should not be more than 2 degrees centigrade. While pursuing 1.5 degrees centigrade, which was a threshold, it is very much important for minimizing the different catastrophic impacts of the climate change. Particularly, we can say the vulnerable nations, vulnerable ecosystems, and for the vulnerable communities. The second important objective was to reduce greenhouse gas emission. If we will reduce greenhouse gas emission, then only it will be possible to control the temperature rise, global temperature rise. So, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, countries are required to set their own NDCs, which is the main focal theme of this agreement. This agreement talks about that the countries should have their own nationally determined contribution, not like Kyoto Protocol in which binding targets were set. Here the different thing is that countries should have their own nationally determined contributions, means each and every country should outline their own objectives, own goals, their own plan in order to reduce the greenhouse gas emission. As there is no binding commitments like Kyoto Protocol, the results will be fruitful as planners have thought to be, but it is not in reality. If we talk about the contributions are non-binding, but the main thing here, the contributions will be reviewed after every 5 years. Means what the countries have set their plan, what the goal they have set, and what are the strategies they have followed to achieve this goal. Everything will be reviewed for each and every nation after every 5 years, with the expectation the countries will enhance their ambition over time in order to reduce the greenhouse emission. So, this was the second major objective. The third major objective of Paris Agreement is to achieve net zero emissions. This was the important thing to be noticed. The agreement calls for achieving a zero balance between the greenhouse gas emission and the removals, and how it will happen. For example, such as through reforestation or carbon capture. Means through reforestation, we can increase the carbon sinks, means the carbon which is emitted, that can be sinked through this green cover, means the carbon in the atmosphere, the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere will reduce. And secondly, through the carbon capture, means here the greenhouse gas or the carbon dioxide will be removed directly without being emitted to the atmosphere. So, overall, it is said that the zero balance between the greenhouse gas emissions and the removals that is to be achieved up to second half of the 21st century. That was the main target of Paris Agreement. So, this goal is often referred as net zero emission. Why? Meaning that emission produced are either offset by removal or reduction strategies. Means removal, you can give the example of carbon capture, storage, and for reduction you can give example of reforestation, afforestation, etc. So, this was the third major objective. Fourth one, the Paris Agreement talked about the enhanced adaptation effects. It focused the need for the countries to strengthen their own potentials, capacities to adapt to the changing climate, which included protecting the vulnerable communities, particularly from the extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and various other climate-related hazards and the disasters. It also talked about supporting developing countries, mainly by climate finance. That's why this agreement recognizes the different capabilities and responsibilities of countries. We are talking on this topic from long back. If you remember, student, different capabilities and responsibilities of countries means here, as we know that the developed countries are the major polluters of the atmosphere, so they should come forward and they should lead the responsibility of cutting the greenhouse gas, either by reducing their emission or maybe by we can say climate financing, means raising the funds which will help the developing nations to develop some strategies so that they could also take part in the greenhouse gas emission acts. That's why we are talking about here different capabilities and responsibilities of the country, where the developed nations are expected to lead in reducing emissions and providing financial and technical support to the developing countries. So, for this, the commitment was set to mobilize the $100 billion annually as a climate finance by 2020, with the focus for mainly helping the deprived and the developing nations in order to transition to the low carbon economies and adapt to the climate impact. So, it also talks about supporting developing countries. The next thing, it talks about Paris Agreement, the transparency and accountability, because there was no binding targets. It talked about the NDCs, that each and every country should have their own goals and objectives for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. But on the other hand, it also talks about the transparency framework, that the countries must provide information on their NDCs. They have to disclose the emissions, how much emissions they are producing, and they have to disclose their climate actions, what are the different goals they have made in order to proceed for the greenhouse gas reductions, and what are the supports they are providing, and either what are the supports they are receiving. Everything has to be disclosed in order to maintain the transparency. That's why this agreement also talks about the transparency framework. And transparency framework mechanism actually means to build trust and ensure that countries are meeting their commitments, because as it is voluntary NDCs, that each and every country, according to their own situation, they are devising certain objectives and goals to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So, it becomes very important to review their functions after every 5 years in order to build trust among the countries that each and every country is working for a specific goal. So, after knowing the major objectives of the Paris Agreement, let us discuss some of the key elements and the mechanism through which the Paris Agreement framed out how the greenhouse gas emission can be reduced. For this particular theme or focus, it talked about the nationally determined contributions known as NDCs. Means each and every country has to submit the plan every 5 years, in which their climate goals and strategies for reducing the emissions has to be mentioned, and how much progress they have achieved in achieving their own goal. So, countries are expected to become more ambitious over time for this. We know that NDCs are not legally binding, as we have seen in Kyoto Protocol, but the process of submission, review, public accountability, this encourages each and every country to meet their target. So, here through the NDCs, countries have flexibility in meeting the NDCs, because it is nationally determined contribution. It is a contribution of different nations according to their resources, according to the situation, how they are contributing in cutting down the greenhouse gas emissions. So, this is one of the major key element and mechanism of we can say nationally determined contribution. Another important thing here is global stocktake. It talks about the global stocktake, and first global stocktake was mainly established in 2023, and where the Paris Agreement requires countries to conduct global stocktake. When I'm talking about global stocktake, it means reviewing the progress of different countries in NDCs, means that is nationally determined contributions, how much they have contributed to the reductions in the emission, that has to be reviewed every 5 years. So this is also one of the major key element of this Paris Agreements. It also identified the gap between the current effort and what is needed to limit the global warming up to 1.5 degree centigrade, or even we can say 2 degree centigrade. Paris Agreement also talked about the loss and damage mechanism. This concept of loss and damage mechanism, that actually refers to the some of the irreversible, or we can say permanent impacts of the climate change, we can say loss of lives, livelihoods, ecosystem, that particularly the vulnerable nations like small island states, or we can say coastal countries generally faces. So for them, this agreement talks about loss and damage. Particularly, it is very much important for the islands, developing states known as SIDS or LCDs, we can say. So discussion around loss and damage focuses on how to provide financial and technical assistance to these vulnerable countries suffering from these permanent and irreversible impact. So this is the one of the somewhat we can say new and different thing that Paris Agreement talks about. We have already discussed about the climate finance, because under the bearing the different responsibilities, the developed nations have to raise climate finance, which was set to mobilize, that is $100 billion per year goal, was the central part of the Paris Agreement, and it was thought that to be mobilized by 2020 and can be extended up to 2025. This climate finance includes the grants, loans, private investments, which can be channeled through green climate fund. So the channelization will be through the green climate fund, to which countries it is to be distributed. So this is also one of the important we can say element of Paris Agreement. Carbon markets and cooperative approaches, another very important key element of this agreement. And if you remember, student, we have also talked about carbon trading and all. The Paris Agreement also established certain framework for carbon trading and for cooperative mechanism, that was under the Article 6. Actually, through this, it allows the countries that should voluntarily cooperate each other in trading of emission and reduction, or implementing the joint product to meet the NDC more cost effectively. So it also talks about carbon markets and cooperative approaches. So what are the progress and challenges this Paris Agreement faced? If we talk about the current scenario of the emission, we know despite of Kyoto Protocol, despite of the Paris Agreement, the global emissions have continued to rise consistently. If we interpolate according to the recent assessment, which states that the world is not on the track to meet 1.5 degree centigrade or even the 2 degree centigrade target. So, according to the current policy, it is stipulated that the global temperature will rise by 2.7 degree to 3 degree centigrade by the end of the century, which will lead to severe repercussions and climatic impacts. So, it can be said that current emissions is not on the track. It is not following the track of several COPs, summits, whatever we can say. There is a lot of ambition gap, because when we have said nationally determined contribution, it depends upon the ambitions of the country, how ambitious they are to cut down the emissions in order to achieve the goals of the NDCs. So this was one of the biggest challenge and gap between the countries, that current NDCs and what is needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. Many countries' current pledges even fall short of the necessary emission reduction if we talk about. Again, if we see the climate finance gap, because the Paris Agreement talks about raising $100 billion climate finance every year up to 2020, and which can be extended up to 2025. But these raising of $100 billion annually have fallen short of this target. That is to be noted. This is one of the major gap we can say. So particularly the failure to meet this financial commitment has eroded the trust between the developed and the developing countries, making it harder to achieve global cooperation. There were several even political challenges also, because of political shift. That is the key challenge to address the climate change, either we can say nationally or globally. For example, you can say the United Nations. We know that it is one of the largest greenhouse gas emitter, and which withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2017 under the presidency of Donald Trump, but rejoined in 2021 under the presidency of Joe Biden. So certain political shifts also pose challenges for achieving the goals of these summits. That's why the shifts in the national policies, especially in major emitting countries, the developed countries, that affects the global momentum of the climate action to a greater extent. Talking about impact of COVID-19, this was also a challenge. Everyone knows that the COVID-19 pandemic led to the temporary reduction of the emissions in 2020. That is basically, we know that because of economies slowdown and lockdowns, this emission quickly rebounded again as the economies recovered, highlighting the need of long-term structural changes rather than short-term reduction mainly driven by the crises. So this is also one of the major challenge here. So we have talked here what is Paris Agreement, when it came into force, what are the major objectives and key elements of the Paris Agreements, and what are the challenges of the Paris Agreement, why this is so important, why under the different COPs we talk about Kyoto Protocol, we talk about Paris Agreement. It has some speciality, some unique things. If we delve into its analysis, we found that the global cooperation, because in the Paris Agreement, because this Paris Agreement brought together almost 200 countries, making this summit as the most inclusive internationally in order to evaluate climate framework till date. That's why here we can say it is regarded as very important, because it has brought almost 200 countries together while formulating climate actions in order to address the climate change. We know that in order to address the climate change, the global cooperations between the different nations is the necessary part for which this Paris Agreement worked out. It is also said as catalyst for the national policies, because this agreement motivated various countries to implement more robust national policies through the NDCs, that is in terms of renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable development, etc. Even various nations have adopted net zero emission goal for mid of the century, which was also inspired by the Paris Agreement. Talking about this important, the Paris Agreement has also spurred unprecedented engagement from the business, from the financial institutions, from the cities, civil society, etc. Even many of the countries have set their own goals or in their own carbon neutrality goals. There is now a very much growing investment in clean technology and sustainable infrastructure in the various countries, if we can see mostly in the European countries. As this agreement also talks about adaptation and resilience, which provides support to specifically to build resilience against the climate adversities, mainly for the vulnerable nations, particularly like small islands we talked about, least developed countries we talked about. So as we know, it considered the most deprived regions of the world also. So it is important in terms of the inclusiveness. Overall, by analyzing all these aspects of Paris Agreement, it can be said that Paris Agreement is one of the very important framework for global climate action, as it sets a clear vision for limiting global warming, and it also offers a mechanism for cooperation, adaptation and finance through the NDCs, which is a very good example. But we know, however, meeting its goal, we know that it will require enhanced emissions from the different countries, stronger commitments and even from urgent actions from the different countries, which we have seen that have fall short. The next few decades, if we talk about, that will be very much crucial in determining whether the world can limit warming to safe levels and avoid the most catastrophic impacts to climate change. We have to view that and we have to work for that. So, dear students, that's all for today's lecture. We will meet again for the next lecture. Have a nice day. Thank you.